Thanks, Jamie. How many years have you been working here in Waterloo?
Wow, 18?
18. Yeah. Well, I've got a while to go to catch up, eh? It's good to be here. It's a real treat to look out and see so many familiar faces. And yeah, I remember this building in all different stages of my life. So it's great to be here and share. And yeah, it's true. I got the end of the coffee. So if you were looking for a coffee and you didn't get one, it tasted really good. I'm grateful to be here and to worship God with you and to share a message from God's Word is a real blessing. It's good. I would invite you, if you have a Bible, to open to Matthew chapter 8. We're going to be thinking about some of the words of Jesus this morning. And before we read them, before we dive in, maybe I'll just preface our time in the Word this morning with this being a pretty challenging passage. To not let a challenge scare us away, to recognize that it's God's grace that brings us to these challenges and God's grace that brings them through, but also not to wish away some of the more challenging things that Jesus says about following Him. So I'm going to just start by reading Matthew chapter 8, verses 18 to 22. When Jesus saw large crowds around him, he gave the order to go to the other side of the sea. A scribe approached him and said, "Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go." Jesus told him, "Foxes have dens and birds of the sky have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head." "Lord," another of his disciples said, "first let me go bury my father." But Jesus told him, "Follow me, and let the dead bury their own dead." We had the opportunity on Friday. My mom and dad had given my oldest son, James, some money to go spend at J&J's Cards and Collectibles here in Waterloo. Don't know how many of you have been in that store or not, but it's a pretty wonderful store if you like cards and collectibles. And we knew that it would be a big experience for the kids because there's just so much, right? And yeah, James would look down one aisle and he said, "Oh, I really want this thing." And then he'd look down another aisle and say, "Oh no, I really want this thing too." And he came to me one point and he said, "I've got a big problem. There's 4 things here that I just need to have." So if you have kids, he's 8 years old, you can know that can go south or that can go north. It can be okay. And he did a great job of managing those feelings of wanting a lot and only being able to have so much. Maybe we can recognize that challenge in ourselves sometimes when life has lots and lots of good options and it's easy to get distracted or to run from this and that and the other and to lose our focus. I really appreciate for James, my son, it's a challenge. He feels a lot of emotional weight when there's a choice to be made like that. And sometimes he just says, "I don't want to be in that situation. Just tell me the one thing and I'll follow that and that'll be good." I think there's some wisdom that I could probably learn from if I could just remember the one good thing and follow after that. Well, Matthew in his gospel has been talking about Jesus' unique mission. It's a different kind of force that he's bringing into the fallenness of the world. Jesus doesn't come with power and authority to change the world. He comes in love and in service. We see this in his birth. Jesus wasn't born in a palace surrounded by the strength and might of a king. He was born in a manger and placed in the feeding trough of animals. And the only people who knew the inside story were dirty shepherds who you couldn't trust anyways. When people came to take his life, it's not as if he called an army to go and battle Herod. He ran away. And there's lots of times where Jesus was willing to be weak so that God's mission could advance. We thought about in our Bible class this morning, Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, praying to God, "Not my will, but yours be done." It was in his weakness that he was able to submit to God and put his authority first. Here in Matthew, Jesus has just taught about the Sermon on the Mount, which has kind of rebuked everyone from saying, look how righteous I am. I can show my good things to God and then God will reward me so much. Jesus says, no, love your enemies, do good in secret, put God truly first. Jesus has come not to change the world by his awesome strength, although he could have. Instead, he chose to come and change it by love and service. Surrounding this passage are some stories of Jesus' amazing healing power. We have the story here in chapter 8 of this centurion, and he knows what it's like to have authority, and he knows that Jesus has authority, so he says, just say the word Jesus, and I know you can heal my son. After this story, we have Jesus going out into a boat and speaking to the winds and the waves, and they all stop. We have him going across the sea and driving out demons. And the people there are so astounded, so amazed at the power of Jesus that they say, you know what? We don't need that much terrifying power here. Please go away. Jesus' power is on full display in the midst of this call to discipleship. Jesus has an intention here in the story. They're getting ready now to go across the sea. Don't always understand why or how Jesus knew this was the moment, but it was time to move on. And so he says, it's time to go, but he gets immediately distracted by a couple requests. There's two men who come and speak to him, and I want to just consider what following Jesus means in the example of each of these men. The first is the scribe, and he claims that he'll follow Jesus wherever he goes. Sounds like an ideal disciple. He calls Jesus teacher, term of respect, of authority. Perhaps he has in mind the common teacher, rabbi, who would go around and teach people. Perhaps he wanted to be a student of this rabbi. Did he come to devote himself to Jesus, or that so that Jesus could be a powerful career opportunity for him? Jesus might be his avenue to success. Jesus responds to his offer of following by explaining what it means to really follow him, what it's really like. Perhaps Jesus speaks to the heart of this man, what he's really looking for and what Jesus really has to offer. To follow Jesus is to leave comfort, is to leave security, is to step into a life of transient wandering, of homelessness. To follow Jesus is to utterly depend on God. Jesus here in his response, he refuses to be domesticated into what this man wants him to be. He says, you can't take me and use me for your purposes. I'm not going to come and fit into your plans. It reminds me of a story I once heard about a king, with many subjects, and one of his subjects just loved the king. He appreciated all the king had done, and so he brought the very best of his produce, and he laid it before the king, and he gives his speech. Thank you so much for your wise rule, for all the things you do for us. I just want to glory in what you bring to us, king, and so here's my gift. And the king turns around and says, how wonderful to have a subject like this. I'm going to take you, and I'm going to make you the master of all the gardens of the palace. You're going to come here, and we're going to work together to build something wonderful. There's another subject of the king standing by, and he sees what happens, and he develops a plan. And so he goes home, and he gets the best horse he owns. He's has all these beautiful horses, and he brings it, and he gives it to the king, and he makes the same speech, and he waits back for the king to bring him many riches and many good things. But the king sees through it, and so he says, well, thank you very much for your gift. Go about your business and have a nice day. And the servant says, well, wait a second here. Don't you see what I did for you? And the king says, well, I understand, but you see, that man, he was giving a gift to me. You were trying to give a gift to yourself. On the other hand, we have the disciple. We already know he's a disciple. He's not a volunteer. He's someone who's been called, and he calls Jesus Lord. Already we come to see his heart, that he's here to follow and obey. He brings his desire as a request. He sees Jesus' authority. But the disciples' loyalties are divided. Despite being called, he wants to stay and take care of his responsibilities at home. He's willing to pursue his call to discipleship, but just after these other concerns. Like the scribe, maybe he sees a more stable life than that which discipleship with Jesus demands. His request seems so reasonable. Surely this responsibility, this obligation is worthy, but Jesus responds, "Follow me." He places a claim on the life of the disciple that's decidedly uncomfortable. Jesus' words are strong, maybe even they sound harsh, and they imply the priority that Jesus' call to discipleship is something as sacred as caring for the dead, even more so. No obligation, no matter how reasonable, takes precedence over following him. I've heard this passage explained that perhaps this man is really saying, my father is ill. Give me a few months to wait out the end of his life, and then I'll come follow you. Or perhaps the man is saying, I really need to worry about my inheritance, so let me get set up to be in the right place and then manage these affairs. And once things are stable, then Jesus, I'll come follow you. I don't know. I don't know exactly what was going on in the life of this disciple. And I suppose it's understanding that we might try to soften this call to discipleship into a way that seems more reasonable to us. But at the end of the day, I think the truth is discipleship demands radical rending from the fabric of this world, often in ways that makes us uncomfortable. That's more than just a little scary. So what does it mean to follow Jesus? Well, Jesus shows that he will not be distracted from his own call, and he doesn't want to let his disciples be distracted either. And so he leaves a would-be disciple on the shore and maybe not so gently wrenches another called disciple into the boat as they're about to leave. Both these men probably seem reasonable to us in one way or another. And maybe we even more easily identify with them than with Jesus in this story. How drastic and demanding the character of Jesus' call is. It's hard not to be like the scribe that can often seek to see Jesus for our own purposes, to try to make him fit into what we want life to be like. Or to be like the disciple, who's ready to put Jesus first as Lord, but there's just a few things that I think should come first, a few responsibilities I need to get right. Jesus' call comes before every obligation we have in this world. This call requires a radical change of who we are and what commitments take charge in our life. Every action rooted in the world is passing away, and they can compose a threat to our capacity and our willingness to follow Jesus. We live in an age of distractions, things that dull our hearing or distort our vision, that deaden our hearts, careers or sports or the media or the news, the television or the pandemic around us. Even life in the church sometimes can prove to be a distraction to really following Jesus. So maybe we would despair, and again, I would encourage you not to. If there's one consistency in all the people who follow Jesus in the Bible, is that they all struggle with this. So if you think I probably do too, that's okay. It is by grace that we pursue and continue, and we sit with this very challenging call. So where does this passage live? I hope you'll consider a couple of these thoughts and try to let them stick with you this week. Is there a good and important task that's distracting or diverting you from following God's reign in your life? I don't know what that might be for you, but is there something that you do a lot or that you recognize takes up a lot of your time, but you know God would like me to be somewhere else? Jesus calls his disciples towards some kinds of transience, some kinds of dependence, some kinds of following. I don't think this passage is here so that we'll romanticize or idealize poverty or homelessness. But I don't think it's here either so that we can explain away the sometimes terrifying and always demanding call of Jesus to follow him. The disciples' daily dependence is on God. It's not embodied in these political structures or these economic structures that it's so easy to let take up our lives. Making money, making friends, gaining wealth, gaining power. Jesus came and he lived completely opposite to all these things, and he calls his disciples to come and do the same. Where does our power, where does our security come from? As disciples, it should be a witness for others to see and hear in our lives that our hope isn't here on earth, it's in following Jesus. It can be so easy to follow Jesus from my comfortably safe places, in the prevailing social and political and economic structures while I live here on earth, where I really just do what's comfortable. The challenge, what it's really about, is following Jesus in witness to God's power and God's presence. Where and how does the church show this participation in God's reign, in God's kingdom? How does it stand forth clearly distinct from our world? Where is God calling me to live different, to trust different, to invest different? Because Jesus Christ has called me. The call to discipleship is a truly challenging one. If it feels overwhelming and daunting, I think that means that we're grasping it the way that Jesus is sharing it. The challenge is not to explain that away or to ignore it, but instead to sit with that tension, to pray about that tension, to ask the Spirit to open our eyes and our hearts to how God wants us to follow Jesus today. And as we do, sometimes we'll find our weaknesses, maybe individual weaknesses, maybe collective weaknesses. Let's not forget what the one who is calling us is like. He is a man of service, a man of love, a man of sacrifice, a man who chose to die for us. The scary thing sometimes is what we leave behind here on this side of the lake. But let's not forget that Jesus has something truly great waiting for us on the other side, and that the journey that we take with him to get there will open our eyes on how powerful and wonderful he is. Let's take that journey together, following Jesus.